愿定归须求
君君觉自身能把浪给造瓦如来巴顿内贝巴杜玛耶果巴真巴真巴真吉罗。本心内美定为天三地心度尼卡真真须求内。念真kun tu念波伦贝罗，云学美巴给我真吉。无所有啊，就一就不行，有路这边就我真巴当，其为这速路单真马行，看那人瑞去寻常瓦拉，念吧念波念念念别错，扎心扎瓦南阳碰瓦当。一座大大竹板吹巴拉，那杜巴当边巴金吉罗。这边民人的根据高，一点没容心被本作给，你没人的他被的瓦了，多年全部给我经历了。那三八第一场八一，真当起心八有全部一，天被撒我所说他巴了，就把年不这把经历了。让你自足龙华居心度，马玉周啊平阳真照啊，尊内周啊周围 QQ 会，讲究真求胸巴经济路，身上给养走真能尊啦，公巴没那讲究民主吧，来吧真内给谁东巴啦，怎巴着不路吧经济路。罗贝有拉因瓦西谢心，养那等拉自心学巴伊，西内拉等尊日这为拉玛，牛的求拉给我经济路，东莫浪家牛的给巴那，台巴经济小给这些的。加上给我中央当巴的，带来牛的出发经济路。这些我就拿你就被吸，拿他当成东巴生活了。什么没被你把你给你走到这中华经济了？你就在宁波人你给的那些行动被送把一。真是心中超来米也我当被自身主把经济了。这点浪上准备新年当自身准备就能下点心，新南南一半的准备做，牛儿喜欢经济拉皮走，给我滚着养大拉马当，这没去一百了浪手心，撒然浪一应等 rapsoni，多谢相给狗帮牛肉手。这然做给这南拉，将这巴的丹尼给自己，大给今年给北上南给，着了本事sang给主把手，sang给这然做给这南拉，将这巴的丹尼给自己。大给这是给北上南给，着了本事sang给主把手。sang ge jaran zo ge janam la jan jo bar de dan ni ge zi ji da ge jin yin ge be zon nam ge zhou la ben zhi sang ge zhu bar zhou sa ji bu gi zhu ji me zhang zhang bri rab lin ji nin de gan ma di sang ge jin de meg de war gi Yogananda Jinla Jabba So Idama Guru Rana Mandala Kam Niyataya.
Okay. We did have a break, right? Last week there was no class. So we're picking up where we ended last time, is reached up to, I think, 14th verse in the first chapter. And so I prepared one handout, one page. This verse is, it's the references that I saw to it described it as appearing in the Vinaya scriptures, but it's also found in a Sanskrit collection that's called the Udana Varga. Udana Varga is probably not as well known as the Pali Dhammapada, but it's kind of a Sanskrit version of the Dhammapada. They're not identical, but there's a great many verses that are common to both texts. Oh, thank you very much. And so anyway, this verse, I didn't give you it's in the first chapter. The first chapter of the Udana Varga is on impermanence. And in the Tibetan literature, the subject matter is described as the four ends. Use the word end because in the verse, the word end, a noun as an end, anta, appears in each of the four padas. So there are four things that are generally thought of as elements of samsaric existence that are favorable. So one of the things, one of the kind of themes in the discussion of developing renunciation is that there are, the Tibetan phrase is the korwe punsok. Korwa is a word for samsara, and punsok means fortune, or the how do I say, the elements of samsaric existence that are generally thought of as desirable. So health, wealth, long life, and so on. And so in order to develop genuine renunciation, we have to see especially those things about samsaric existence which the ordinary person would not typically would feel inclined to view as desirable and to still have attachment for. And so if you want to develop genuine renunciation, kind of that's the test of whether you in fact are able to experience that or come to understand what that really means. So this verse, it takes four things. So the first one is then accumulations. So accumulations would, be referred to abundance of material prosperity. So it says all accumulations end in, I translate it as loss. The idea being that, at some point, even all riches in the end are dissipated and vanish. So that's the first end. And then tombo nandita. Tombo means then an elevated state. So that would be any kind of position. There's a famous story of a king, I forget his name, who was sought Indra's wealth, and then at the end of his life, he falls. And so that his story is emblematic of this particular point, which is to say that everything that rises, everything that takes a high position, eventually will be lost. Anyway, I don't want to really make this verse kind of go into too long. But anyway, the third one in particular is a topic that we're discussing in this chapter, and it says all coming together. That all coming together means all meeting. By that, it's a reference in particular to family relations, connections with the family, attachment to a family, friends. So all those people that you develop ties with, eventually they, will be lost. They will end up in separation. So that's a theme that Aryadeva is talking about here. And the last one is, of course, impermanence in terms of our mortality. So anyway, this is a well-known verse that is quoted and is meant to suggest kind of the inherent flaws in samsara. So, in particular, the third one, that all coming together into separation, is a theme that this next series of verses that we already started are addressing. And so in connection with that, we mentioned one of the so-called secondary mental afflictions, which is kind of the basic theme of impermanence, and that is the secondary mental affliction in which we are inclined to want to avoid considering our mortality. So in Nagarjuna's Ratnavali text, in the last chapter, he lists a series of these secondary mental afflictions that are not types of secondary mental afflictions that are kind of the common ones that are discussed, especially in Tibetan literature. It mentions, I think I said this before, Vasubandhu refers to them as being found in a collection called Chudraka Vastu, which I think you're familiar with. Is that thought of as a Vinaya work? So apparently, in that particular part of the canon, there are these kind of attitudes, these kind of inferior attitudes are listed. There's a bunch of them, and they have this. They end with the term vitarka. Vitarka is translated in Tibetan as nambar tokpa, which usually means a conception. But here vitarka means more a kind of a thought or a tendency to consider something. So I mentioned before, amara vitarka is the one about death. And then, so there's this one also is called Nyati vitarka. Nyati means your close relations, your family, and those that you have a close personal tie with, your cousins, your aunts, and your uncles, and your extended family. And so the idea is that we have a natural attachment for those bonds, and they are one of the things in particular that kind of hinder us from devoting ourselves to a spiritual life in a fully committed way. Now, so this is being written by a bhikshu, by a monk, and he's writing from a point of view which considers the lifestyle of a bhikshu to be the ideal. So I just wanted to kind of draw attention to that, and kind of to let you know that some of these elements of Buddhist values are kind of at play in this overall chapter. When we get to the end of the chapter, the final couple of verses address the act of abandoning the householder state and going into the state of homeless, the state of a homeless ascetic. So really, in a way, this whole first chapter is addressing impermanence from that perspective, I think, which is to say that when we consider our own impermanence, and as we discussed it in the one of the earlier classes, the point was to think that life is short, and this is a rare opportunity to gain some benefit from cultivating an understanding of the Dharma, and not only that, kind of the best way to do that is kind of like to leave your family behind and go become this kind of solitary religious practitioner. So I think kind of that attitude is underlying kind of the whole thread of the series of verses. So anyway, with that introduction, let's see what he's saying. He's talking here. It's interesting that he's talking about the relationship between a father and a son, or a parent and a child, and it's kind of curious that it's talking about the death of a child, the death of one's children, which is, I don't think, a common theme in Buddhist literature. But I think he's using it really as an example of pushing at this notion of attachment to family ties. So he's the word that seems to be kind of the focus of this series of verses is the notion of grief, kind of the sense of sorrow that one typically experiences with the loss of a close family member, whether it would be a parent or sibling or child, any kind of relative. And in a way, I don't know how this is coming across to all of you, but I don't think that this is kind of the sort of value or the sort of emotion that we normally would think of as something that we would really aspire to. I mean, many of us think of our family ties as really important. And in a way, Aryadeva is kind of saying the opposite, that they're a hindrance. So we should kind of keep that in mind. So, and he attacks this idea of the grief that the father, the kind of example that's being used in these verses, the grief that the father feels at the loss of the child. And one of the things he said in one of the previous verses was, you're grieving about the loss of another family member, when in fact you're subject to the very same mortality, and you should be as concerned about your own possible demise and be paying attention to that as much as you are the loss of a child. So here we're moving on, and the last verse that we read was talking about the idea that a child or that you give birth to, you don't know where they come from. They take birth. You play a role in it, but ultimately their appearance in your life is due to their own karma, and you don't know where they came from. And then when they depart, you have no idea really what their destination is. And so he's kind of saying that we should be a little more dispassionate about the loss of a child, which I think for the average person is kind of perhaps jarring. I don't know. So anyway, he's saying what he said in the last verse was, where is it here? Oh yeah. Yeah, he's saying, since you don't know where this child came from in the first place, and you don't know where they're going to once they leave this life, then he's saying, it's not, there's nothing sort of inappropriate about the manner in which your child dies, and you shouldn't kind of feel the sense of, why did this child leave me, sort of. So now he's saying, in the next verse, he's saying, you should have anticipated the fact that your own child could very well die before you, and it's only out of ignorance that you don't. So at the bottom of the Tibetan page, he says, it's only due to your ignorance that you were not aware that they were departing, or that they were kind of asking your permission to depart, something, letting you know that they were going to leave. It's kind of the way the verse is introduced, following Chandrakirti's commentary. So he says, Chikduna, on one hand, he said, he says, it's not the case that they left without asking, which is the way the leaving without asking was mentioned in the previous verse as something that kind of the abruptness with which they left was sort of kind of the part of the cause that amplified your grief. So here it's saying, well, you really shouldn't not have felt that it was so surprising that they died, right? So then the verse itself says it's because of your own ignorance. So it's due to your own ignorance that you were not aware of the child, and then departure or death is understood. And then the second half of the verse says, this is an interesting phrase. It says, his or her, it says, desire to leave, was made evident by their age. So it's implying that this was not an infant. This was not a young child. This was an adult that passed away, or in the example that the verse is sort of portraying. So it's saying, basically saying, death is natural. Death is comes to everyone, and particularly it's going to come to you. And it's your own ignorance, your own kind of lack of awareness about this mortality, that if you felt that the death of a family member was unexpected, it's your own sort of just your own kind of lack of understanding of life. So again, and then saying that the point being that the grief that you're feeling ultimately because of your attachment to the family member is inappropriate, and you should not have attachment to your family members, and ultimately you should be even willing to walk away from them, as he says towards the end of the verse. So he says, "Chiran timu bechinna bui parot joy tema temana." So he's saying, in fact, everyone, or maybe not in every case, but in the natural course of a person's life, there are signs of a person's mortality. He or she can become sick. He or she can become old, and those traits are, in fact, sometimes they're referred to as Yama's messengers. That they're letting you know that the final end is not far off. So it says, "Parodudro means the signs that you are going to the next life, to the next one. Parodu means the far side, means to another life. Then Namartava means you just, those signs were there, you just chose not to recognize them. You chose not to notice them. You chose not to be aware of them. Yinte. Then it says, Jitem parotu droshe dengi. Dengi means implicitly, right? Without saying it directly. Then those signs showed. Draw. This is the interesting phrase. I looked this up and was able to come up with a kind of an interpretation of a reading of it, which I think kind of helps understand the language. So the phrase literally says willingness to go. Draw and ni. And ni is a particle which shows a state or a quality, the quality of wanting to go. So his or her desire to go, gebe means by the quality of having aged, was shown. So it's saying it should not have been a surprise to you that the person died. You shouldn't have felt shocked or anything like that. And the word ignorance there also is there's a kind of an underlying kind of message from that, which is to say, which is to imply that we as individuals, need to realize more about our own condition, our own human condition, and make decisions that relate to that have a spiritual implication to them, and that it's out of ignorance that we fail to do so. So anyway, going back to this phrase of desiring to go. So it literally says there is another in the Sanskrit dictionary. There's a word which says literally it means the desire to go. Here, if that were translated into Tibetan exactly, it would say draw derva. It wouldn't say draw. So draw is probably another word besides the word kama, which is desiring or wanting. but I believe it probably is something quite similar. Draw means, it can mean a kind of willingness. But what's interesting is that the word, the entry in the dictionary says, it says, the word literally means wishing to go. And then it has a secondary meaning on the point of departure. And then it has another meaning which means you're about to die. So the phrase wanting to go has this secondary meaning of being about to die. So in fact, that's what the verse, that's how the verse should be understood. So it's saying this person's, imminent passing was something that you should have realized, and therefore not feel this great sorrow, which ultimately comes from your attachment, right? So I mean, the real message is we ought to overcome our attachment to our family relations. Okay, so anyway, the verse, the explanation of the verse is pretty straightforward. He says the aging is indicated by such attributes as the whitening of the hair and so forth, and and the nyerma means wrinkles, aging skin. So it's basically saying you should have known that this could happen, and you should not have the kind of typical feeling of great sorrow and grief at the passing of your family member. And then so here there's now a reference to a kind of an incident or a story. I'm not sure what the source of the story is, but Chandrakirti spells it out a little bit more, where he talks about, he says, a father of an only child, in fact, it says, Buchikpa means only child, right? Buchikpa shik kurgi chirdu. Now, kur usually means a burden, but here it probably means something more like a task, or some perhaps venture that is for the benefit of the family. Kurgi chirdu pe tawa means the father deliberately advises his only son to go somewhere on some sort of mission, right? Dror, then it's a tangla. Pe tangla means the father, sent it, gave him instructions to go. And then it says, in Chandrakirti, he says, and not only that, he also helped him get ready to go. And then he says, Droar cheba. Droar cheba means, however, then when the son was actually in the process of leaving, then the father got all upset. And right? He was feeling a sense of loss that the child was going to go away. The irony being that the father, in fact, sent it. So then here at the end, so it says Shindu means like that, right? Then it says, so this is a phrase that Chandrakirti gives, which is kind of meant to kind of enhance what the message of the verse is. And he says, and so gets at this commentary, the wording here, if you're looking at it. He says, similarly, right, having been eager to produce a son, it's unreasonable to grieve at death, the outcome of having been born. So it's saying that typically, when you start a family, then you are desirous of having children. So you go to great lengths to create a family, to give birth to your offspring. And at the same time, and this is kind of the spiritual idea, is that, you know, that the natural outcome of birth is death. So you've gone to great lengths to produce these offspring, and it is in the very nature of things, right? As that fourth of the four ends is the end of everything, of every living being, is that it dies. He says, you created the conditions for these children to die in the first place, so to say. So, you know, it's kind of silly for you to grieve at their passing when you're the ones who brought them into being in the first place, and for whom that ultimate end was inevitable, he's saying, right? He says, "Bu keveçer bene," right? Says you went to great effort to give birth to a child, and then here it says "keve jebu." On the other hand, the result, the natural outcome of being born is that they are going to die. So you should know that in the at the outset, and therefore and therefore grieving at that inevitable result is a sign of foolishness. So again, you can see the themes here are that the householder's life, the householder's state, is one which is fraught with many circumstances that end up being obstacles to a pure spiritual career, and that if you are really motivated by the aspiration to follow such a life, then the best thing to do is to walk away from those kinds of relationships. Okay, so then the next verse. Bula che chakpa mirikpa. So this is Niva Bula che chakpa mirikpa, but this verse is described as indicating that it is inappropriate to have great attachment to your children. First one is the main reason why that's so, right? And I think you can't really read these verses from the point of view of a monk talking to you as a householder, and you sort of trying to defend that householder's lifestyle. And I don't think that that works as a really effective way to approach what the verses are trying to say. I think you really have to try to adopt the point of view of the of the monk, the one who has abandoned the householder state, and think of it as he's trying to talk to a householder and tell a householder that he or she is better off, leaving that kind of lifestyle. So this verse says the jidar means to the degree that the father considers the child as dear, right? Jidar pala bu dupa, the degree to which the son or daughter is dear to the parent, the father or mother, to the same degree the child does not reciprocate. The child does not regard the parent with the same kind of affection. That's a kind of challenging sort of notion, but I think that's the point that's being made, is that children are not are not. But how should we phrase it? That children typically don't appreciate, I think, appreciate what their parents do for them, and they're more concerned about what they're doing with their own life than sort of acknowledging what their parents have done to make their life what it is. So he says, and so this first point is that the first half of the verse is saying, whatever your attachment is for your own child, your own child does not feel the same kind of affection towards you. And I guess you can sort of mull over what is the nature of a parent's affection toward a child versus the kind of favorable attitude that a child may have to his or her parent. That by nature, they're opposite relationships, so they're not going to be identical. At any rate, first part. Second part is a different statement, which plays on that. Kind of the nature of that the parent, when the parent shows affection for the child, right? That's a kind of a downward, generationally speaking, a downward, focused than perspective. And the other way around is an upward focused perspective. Now, what's really interesting is what's implied in this is that the average samsaric person has a high regard for inferior things, for lower things. And those things that are more spiritually elevated, which one ought to have a high regard for, are when the typical samsaric person, it's difficult for them to develop that kind of reverence, the reverence for the spiritually elevated. It's much easier to develop or to be governed by your attachment to baser things. That's kind of a theme that's in this verse. So he says, Jikten Dini means this world. This world is meant, the world here is meant as a collective noun for all the beings that make up the world. I mean, mostly human beings talking about. What to draw says, this world is a downward moving sort of cohort, if you want to use that word. So it's saying there's a very famous actually there are two examples that are given. One is the Buddha at some point put his finger on the dirt, into the dirt, lifted it up, and said, the number of beings who go from a favorable rebirth to another favorable rebirth, or from an unfavorable rebirth, having been in an unfavorable rebirth as an animal or whatever, and then being reborn in a favorable rebirth. Sometimes the image is called light versus darkness. So going to a favorable birth is called going to light, and going to an unfavorable rebirth is going into darkness. It says the number of beings who pass from one life to the next in a manner in which they go to either an equally favorable one or from an unfavorable to a favorable one is about like the amount of dirt that's on his finger in comparison to all the dirt that covers the surface of the earth. So that all the dirt, all the particles of dirt that cover the surface of the earth are emblematic of the fact that the great majority of beings either go from darkness to darkness, meaning they go from one unfavorable rebirth to another unfavorable rebirth, or having been in a favorable rebirth, they fall into an unfavorable rebirth. So that's kind of the point that's being made here. Jitenjini walk to draw means this world in the great majority is downwardly moving, like they're going to go to an unfavorable rebirth. So he says, Decher Tori Jangnyeka. The Tori is the Sanskrit word for Tori is Swarga. And Swarga means the realm of light, literally. It refers to worldly God realms. And so in Tibetan, it typically is identified with the term, another technical term, which is Ngumbar Toa. Ngumbar Toa literally means an elevated state. An elevated state means a favorable rebirth. So here, in Buddhism, in typical literature, so there's kind of the person who is not, how should we do this? So, you know, the ideal spiritual seeker is a person who seeks an ultimate goal, seeks complete liberation. And so that's a person who has the good karma, or has the, use the word Buddha nature, but who has the capacity or the inclination to, to pursue a permanent state of well-being. And so that person in conventional Buddhism would be a person who becomes a homeless ascetic. So that leaves the rest of humanity that stays in the householder's state. So typically, those individuals will not have. There are exceptions, but typically those persons are not going to be able to pursue such a permanent, ultimate goal. So for them, what is a suitable spiritual aim? And that is a kind of temporary form of happiness. Temporary form of happiness is to live a virtuous life, and therefore to be reasonably confident that he or she will find a favorable rebirth in the future. Mm-hmm. So here, that's what Tori means. They're saying, because the great majority of the world is downwardly focused, he says, even the ability to attain, a temporary goal, the temporary goal of a favorable rebirth is, then the word is that nyevarka. Nyevarka literally means difficult to obtain. Difficult to obtain means few people will even be able to attain a favorable rebirth, much less seek an ultimate goal like nirvana or Buddhahood. So difficult to obtain is a phrase which really means it's very rare. It's very rare that people would even achieve the temporary goal. Now, that's a pretty strong message if you take it to heart. but it's there. It's there in this verse, right? So he's saying, he's saying you have great attachment to your own child, but guess what? Your child probably doesn't have the same degree of affection for you. And by the way, most ordinary beings, because of their attachments to samsara, are unlikely even to attain the temporary goal of a favorable rebirth. So that's a pretty harsh message, I think, if you read it in a clear-eyed way. Right? So it says the child doesn't really feel the same way about you that you do about him or her. Then it says Jiktemba Bula Sopa Oma Dagla Seba. So it says Jiktemba, I mean, it says, then here it says the world, which he gets it as saying Bula Sopa, means such as your children, he's saying. Oma Dagla Seba. So it says, the verse says they are downward going. But here he switches a little and he says, who are attached to something inferior. Right? That means they are attached to samsaric objects rather than to something of a spiritual nature. Therefore, he says, he says the way in which the ordinary person has attachment for base things, Wogmadak means then those lower persons, right? So a lower person here is generationally lower person is your own child. Geogoma means a higher person, right? Higher person here is the father, the parent, mother. Goma dalaseba kewamin means it's saying they don't have the same degree of attachment or even regard for a higher person. So that example here is saying the real higher object is then the Sangha or the Buddha. So it says then here he's Gesab is continuing with this point of that children are, he's saying, ungrateful. He says, so it's saying those children who were produced or who were raised, even once they were born, you taken care of them and you raised them with hundreds of difficult exertions. Jeva Sheva is an idiom, is a phrase that means gratitude. Jeva Sheva means to know what was done. Kurtanya means to be aware of the things that were done for your benefit. Heva literally means loose. So it means their gratitude is not very strong. Because they don't have such gratitude towards their parents. Chandrakirti says they would look at them in the same way that one might look at a stranger. Kechi la dorwa means that in an instant they would abandon them. That's pretty harsh language. Then it says, so if their attachment is for something in Chandrakirti, he describes that kind of downward focused interest, is saying that your children, as an indication of the fact that they don't have the same sort of so I'd say affection for you, the parent, that you have for the child, is evidenced by the fact that if they become adults and they gain their own family, then they're going to have affection for their children, not for you. So it's saying, it's because that's kind of, extending that notion of it goes in the other direction, not it goes downward, on and on from generation to generation, rather than looking upward. So it says, and then he says, so their attachment is focused downward, right? In that sort of metaphorical sense. And it says, just as their attachment is directed, then their karma will, project them. The karma will send them, will cause their future to be determined. Therefore, I said, therefore, Jiktemba Dini. Here it says Jiktemba. It says in the verse it says the world. Here, Getsabje has shifted the noun. It doesn't say world. He says literally worldling, right? So it means a worldly person. But the verse actually is this collective noun, which means samsaric beings. Collectively, Panchar means in the majority, Nyawa Sopa means most of them are headed to the hells and other such places. Nyawa Sopa for that reason, even attaining, Swarga means a higher realm's birth is rare. Tarba Tachimur. Then this is also in Chandakirti's. He adds, if it's rare for them to attain even the temporary goal, then needless to say, it is extremely rare that they might attain nirvana. So, and then he says, given that, so the message of the verse is, don't be like that. It says, Goma means higher beings. So higher beings means and those who are worthy of veneration, right? Those who are spiritually worthy of reverence. Means then we should develop a sense of respect and reverence towards those who are elevated beings. Okay, and then he gives a story. The story is kind of the examples that they give in this case are two, and in Geshe-ji's text there's a typo. It says Shingun. Shingun actually should apparently be Shingun, and this is way beyond me. But from both of these texts, this is apparently, and it, you can find it in dictionaries, is a kind of a food item. For some reason, asafoetida, right?
Oh,
Shingun.
hing.
Hing. Yeah, hing. So it's like hing. And then the second example that's given is the echo of a bell. And so it's saying that Rimgi Chuserbe Lakpa Shindu Jeba Misoa. So it's saying that gives an example is a group of merchants, I think, traveling. They have whatever supplies they have. They're using what they're, repeatedly dipping into the hing bag, not knowing that somewhere along the line they're going to run out. And then the case of the bell is that when the bell is rung, the sound of the bell is something that slowly fades and then disappears. And those two images apparently here are suggesting that, it's kind of interesting how to take that. I think what it seems to be suggesting is that the opportunity to pursue the Dharma is, temporary. and that and there's a limit to our being able to take advantage of it. And so we ought to be cognizant of that and not waste the opportunity, because at some point, it will be lost. And that seems to be the message that I took from those two examples. Got a better interpretation, and I'm willing to hear it. But it's a jubuke. Jubuke means the sound of a bell. Ringi, chuserva means, chuserva in this case means it will, dissipate the sound, the echo of the bell being rung. Serve, lakba means then it will be lost. That sound will be lost. Like that, jeba misoe. Jeba misoe means if you do not develop a sense of gratitude, right? Jeba soa is, in the seven limb instruction for developing bodhicitta, right? So the first one is Marasheva, is to recognize that all beings have been your mother and therefore should be regarded as your mothers. Then the second one is Jinjemba. Right? Jinjemba then is to recall their kindness. And the third one says Jinsoa. Jinsoa is usually translated as to repay their kindness. But it really means more generally is to feel a sense of obligation because of your gratitude, right? So this is Jeba Sheba and Jeba Soa is a sense of feeling a sense of obligation. Here it is saying that it seems to be saying something like, if we don't recognize the importance of the opportunity that this life presents to us, and we don't sort of develop this proper degree of appreciation of it, churashikpa. Churashikpa means then the Dharma will be destroyed, it will be lost. And therefore, therefore, even a higher rebirth will be very difficult for us to obtain. So that's kind of interesting, sort of, what should I say, moral to what the verse is saying. Okay, so I mean, those verses are they have a certain punch to them if you listen to what they're saying. I think the kind of the basic idea is it's saying, don't get sucked in to family relationships. You're better off sort of withdrawing, detaching if you can. Okay, that's that verse. And the second one says, and Padan Jesu mitun galayan chabar mirikpa. So another part of this series of verses is the idea that we have affection, and that affection towards our children and towards our family is a good quality. So here he kind of attacks what the quality of that affection really consists of. So let's see. Let me look at. So it says. So he's proposing this question: what is the nature of your affection towards your child? Is it something that you feel Jesu mitumbe bula when Jesu tumba layin chang? So this is in Chandakirti. It doesn't. It does say everything there. So padan Jesu mitun galayan chakba mirupa. So Jesu tumba is means someone that is kind of anukula means you're on good terms with, right? And Jesu mitumba means that we all have of like children that go against the wishes of their parents and are headstrong or just refuse to follow the guidance of their parents and go do things against their parents' wishes. So that's just a mitumba. They're saying, is the affection that you feel towards your child, the affection that you feel towards a quote good child, or is it affection towards a one that didn't abide by your wishes? And he says, so he's asking, the verses implies that you're asking, what is the nature of the relationship with your child towards which you feel that affection, and the affection being the source of your grief. So it's saying typically when they are a difficult child, and so they are those that are at odds with you, it's just a mitumba, then how dear, in fact, do you view that child? If they are one that was always sort of rejecting your advice, do you in fact have affection towards such a child? He says, is it the case that the affection that you feel is only when the child is one that you are on good terms with? He says, if that's the case, then what you're calling this affection that you're saying is the reason for you to maintain your attachment to your family, he says, then your affection is really a kind of like a transaction, like a business transaction. If they behave the way you want them to behave, then you will develop affection for them. If they don't behave the way you want them to, then you won't have that same affection. So he's saying that affection is perhaps not as pure a feeling as you may think it is. Geoset means it says if that's the nature of your affection, if your affection is only towards those children, that you think highly of because they were quote good children, then you're really that's what we call a conditional love, right? It's only when the child is one that listens to you. It says, so therefore he's saying that your grief at the loss of the child is conditioned by the fact that the child was one that you favored, not simply because it was your child. And so it's really a form of attachment in your own mind, rather than some kind of pure feeling that you had for the loss of the child. And so it gives he gives a story here, which is again sort of ironic, where he says, for example, and this is kind of a shortened version of the story that's told in Chandrakirti's commentary. He says, there was a certain king who had a very dear son, and that son, Ducheva means what?
At that time.
Huh? What does that mean, Ducheva?
Past tense of time.
Right. It means die.
Oh, died,
Yeah.
really?
So the idiom is, kala is the word for time.
Oh, interesting.
Kala kurta means to meet their time, right? It means to die. It says the son passed away. Then it says here, the ministers, Lombonanki, they used the phrase, which here literally means renso, means become stiff. This term came up before, and so I think maybe they were trying to use a some kind of euphemism for the person, for the deathless child. But the irony is that this word stiff has a secondary sense of being arrogant. So the king misunderstood that what the ministers said. They were telling him he's gone, stiff as a board. But the king thought they were saying, your son has become arrogant. When they said that, chugne means he became agitated. It means he became angered. And then he set out to kill his son, right? Sebe to shukso, right? Then when he was preparing to go to attack his son for the affront, so then they clarified the word stiff and said, no, he wasn't being arrogant, he died, right? Then the king said, good, he's dead. Meaning my arrogant child is gone.
Oh, God.
So, again, I think it's meant to be amusing, but the idea is kind of playing on this notion of affection for a child, right? And the favorable child versus the unfavorable child, and that the affection was gone the minute he got the idea that maybe his son was not behaving, in a proper way, and so the affection was gone. And so when he hears that the child is dead, he says, "Oh, good riddance." Right? So it's really kind of poking fun at family attachments. Right? So again, as I say, the best way to read these verses is as a monk would be talking to a layperson, if you can do that, right? So, all right, so that's that verse, right? Okay, so okay, so going on, I don't know if this is the last one. It may be. We're still talking about this sense of affection and attachment for family relations, and it's how they don't represent some kind of truly laudable kind of feelings. I think it's fair to say these are samsaric feelings, and so they are sort of inherently flawed. It is part of the message. Okay, so now he's saying right? Dungel is talking about grief, right? Literally the suffering generated by separation, right? So he says, in fact, he's saying that grief that we feel at the loss of a family member, minam means for humans, nyingle nyurdokte. He's saying, will literally swiftly leave the heart. He says, it only lasts so long, he says. Meaning that affection that you have for your family members, which is really holding you back from becoming a homeless ascetic, right, is really not such a pure feeling at all. It says, in fact, even though you feel pain at the loss of a family member, that pain doesn't last for so long. So that affection that you claim to have is also temporary, right? He says, Chaglaang, right? Chaglaang dunge jewai sembe miten bani ter. So he's saying, ter is an imperative saying, look, right? See how unstable is your affection, right? Chaglaang. See how unstable is your affection as evidenced by the disappearance of the suffering. There's playing on this separation two ways. The word separation appears in the opening part of the verse, which is the separation that we, the pain that we feel at separation. And then here is sort of playing on that separation, which is saying the separation of the pain means that the pain is not, doesn't last forever, right? What do we say about mourning? That there's an acceptable period of time for mourning, right? You're supposed to mourn for at least X amount of time. If you start partying too soon, that's unseemly. So it's appropriate to grieve. I'm not making fun of the practice, but what he's saying is that the grief that's felt does in fact pass. And so he's saying, if the grief passes, then that's an indication of the fact that your affection is also temporary. Okay. Right? He's saying here that attachment is not as strong as you might want to believe that it is. So it doesn't necessarily last so long, right? Right? And here, notice here he's saying the bond of affection. Right? So that means the affection is really a form of attachment, and therefore it is a mental affliction, which is a kind of samsaric bond. He says, means if it did not become loose, if you were not able to overcome it, then he says, then if your affection were not temporary, then the pain that the loss created for you would not disappear, right? Mindok means it would not be reversed. It would not stop. However, the attachment also, then what we can observe is that the affection that we have for he makes a statement in the commentary, Chandrakirti does, which is kind of interesting. It suggests, that whatever the the intensity of the loss that you feel when someone that's dear to you passes away, the fact of the matter is that life is such that what you face in the coming days as your life as a survivor continues is such that those other activities tend to drive away really your memory of that person, and that's kind of how that attachment eventually loses its hold on you. Right? So I'm saying that attachment is really not as Tenba means firm. So firm means that it's unshakably strong, right? So it's saying our feelings, even towards our family members, are temporary. And therefore, we should not give too much importance to those attachments. So here's another story, which is again, has this pretty strong irony underlying it. So it says a certain king, right? Gyabu Gashik, means he was literally moving on water. It means they were in a boat somewhere. And he says, Mimayin Gidrusuma. Mimayin means literally a non-human. Mimayin means a spirit, some kind of spirit, harmful spirit. Drusuma means seize the boat. Seize the boat means put the boat in jeopardy of maybe capsizing, or the king put the king's life at peril. So then, faced with that, right? Faced with that situation, his minister said, the loyal minister says to the king, "Dagibum nam kyangzelo," means take care of my children, right? To the king. The minister says, so the minister is going to sacrifice himself for the king. So he says, as he gets ready to jump off the boat to save the king, take care of my children. Che bu means the minister's children. Geabo lacho means he entrusted his children to the king, and having done so, chur chongte means the minister leapt into the water, right? And na kerala, and he says to this spirit, this harmful spirit, take me, na kerala, geotong means don't let the king go, release the king, don't continue to threaten the king. Jebe, and because he did that, then the boat was released. So the king was able to survive. And then here it says, the children were told, and the children were apparently not in the boat, Bunam Pashiwa Terne, right? They heard their father had died, right? Paterne, Dunela, oh, our dear father died. So they felt, grief. Dunela, but Gerabo Lekbakyang, the king was nice, took care of them and raised them. And so what did they think? Pashua, you're thinking yourself. We're lucky that our father died, right? Pashua means the fact that our father died was a good fortune, right? You're thinking your Samba means they thought that. It was lucky for us that our father died. Nyangenyang tendua mahino, right? So here, I'm sorry for laughing at this. He says grief, right? Grief being this. This is the kind of the term that is inherent in this whole series of verses, is the idea that the loss of a family relative produces grief. And that grief comes from the fact that we have strong feeling of affection for our family members, and that feeling of affection is indicative of our attachment to family life, right? So here he's saying that grief, which is the indication of the affection, tendua maino, is not a permanent thing. That's a very interesting statement. There are famous stories, right? There's the story of the woman. I'm reminded of the story of the woman whose child died, right? And she was suffering. The mother feels such grief for her own child. Goes to the Buddha seeking some kind of relief. and the Buddha tells her to go to visit all the houses and see if she can find a house where no one has died. And if that's the case, ask them for a mustard seed. I think something like that. You familiar with that story? Yeah. And so she can't find it, right? So she returns and says, and so that was the message, right? Death comes. It's not, what you experienced is not unique, right? It's all families experience this. But this notion of Nyangin Sewa, one of the things that I think in a completely different context, in the Bodhisattva Bhumi, in the subject of morality, right? How many the kinds of Bodhisattva morality? Do you know them? Sum. 3. So one is the morality of restraint. And the morality of restraint is typically to have taken one of the lifelong forms of Hinayana vows, whether as a householder, right, upasaka, upasika vow, or one of the vows of a monk or nun. And so you take them as a Hinayana vow, but then as part of Mahayana practice, you are still observing that vow as a way of sort of developing some kind of mental self-control. So it's one kind of Bodhisattva morality. Second kind of morality is then to be collecting virtue in order to develop your own spiritual awareness, to elevate it and make it stronger. The third kind of Bodhisattva morality, and there is a progression to it. So the most challenging form of Bodhisattva morality is the morality which acts on behalf of others. And and this is the Bodhisattva Bhumi's presentation. And in that latter category, there are 11 different sort of typical kinds of conduct that are indicative of benefiting others. So one of them is Nyangin Sewa, is dispelling grief. And it talks about, the grief that people feel from loss of a family member, or the grief that people feel failure, a business failure, or some other kind of misfortune. That as a bodhisattva, it's your duty to comfort the person and essentially, to dispel that grief. So that's a completely different sort of perspective on the notion of grief. Here, it's kind of the focus of kind of attacking attachment for householders. Interesting, right? Okay. Jitemba, Shengi Ngorbu. Now here, this is did I tell you this is a typo before? It's on the second to last line. It says Bu Shiwa la Nyangin Chemirikwa. It looks like it says Bu Shing la Nyangin Chemirikwa, right?
Second to last line.
Page is 15.
On 15.
Pagination the same?
Yeah.
Do you see? Sengi Ngorbu Shiwa la.
Let's see.
No? Anybody else reading Tibetan? You didn't have the Tibetan?
I forgot my book one week, and I enjoyed so much just listening and trying to visualize it.
Oh, okay.
But I should probably go back.
That's fine. All right, so this next verse is saying that it's kind of criticizing the tendency to adopt forms of grief that are socially, kind of called for. And he uses kind of the kind of extreme examples of sort of displaying your grief by, mentions, beating yourself or pulling out your hair, things like that, and saying that these are done sort of just to comply with social convention, and that kind of making fun of that. So here is the introduction is saying, okay, so you've convinced me that I really don't have a valid reason for feeling this grief. I was claiming that it was based on my affection for my child. You're telling me that it's really a form of attachment, and therefore, it goes all the way back to the first verse, which is saying, instead of feeling grief, the death of your child, you should be concerned about your own mortality. It started there, right? And we went from there. So here it's saying, okay, so really that sense of grief, I can't justify it on the basis of my own sort of feelings, but rather, jikengi tunjuk. Jikengi tunjuk means it's just I'm doing it in order to conform to social conventions. La Lula Dekpa means, there are, whatever there are, we're talking about the 1st century AD. So I don't know. Here it says Lula Dekpa, physically striking your body, or I mean, over history, isn't there something called what is it called? A vest, some kind of a hair vest or something that people would wear, sort of things to sort of show their
desire to suffer, really.
Who are you?
Yeah.
Hey.
Whoa.
Spears. Hey. Long time.
Snuck in.
Oh yeah. So it's talking about those kinds of things, right? So he says that's not that's not a reason to behave that way. He's saying basically you're being disingenuous. You're faking it. You're being the translations use the word hypocrite. I'm not sure that the word. It's funny. The word is a chichu, right? I'm not sure what the original is in the verse. There is in Buddhist literature we're talking about for ordained people. There are 5 classic kinds of behavior that represent wrong livelihood, right? Lokso, right? And so the point being that the ordained community relies on society for their material needs, whether modest though they may be. And so one of the things that monks and nuns are not supposed to do is called sulche. Sulche means to sort of fake fake being very spiritual, sort of like, in privacy of their own, community. They don't particularly follow a very strict lifestyle, but the minute some potential patron comes along, then they adopt this very, pious behavior. So, that comes from a deceitful place in your mind. So that's considered one of the classic, inappropriate things to do for ordained people. This is a word that's kind of similar to that, but he's talking to the audience, or the person that to whom these verses are being addressed is typically meant to be an ordained person. So I don't think it's that word that's usually translated as hypocrisy. So this teacher is a different term. However, Chandrakirti gives a very he gives a very clear and a very precise description of what the term means, even though I don't necessarily know what the exact original was. Let's see. So it says chicha ni. Right now here, this is Chandrakirti saying what this behavior is. He says rangi dun drube chawe dundu. So it says the motive is to obtain something for yourself. Rangi dundu means for your own purpose. Churmayim bahurchete. Churmayim bahurchete means to adopt an improper form of behavior, right? Churmayimba means adharma, something that's improper. Hurcheva and chete shen ngotzar kyevar to sort of impress another person, and then sort of to take up that kind of behavior. So that's what it means. So it's some kind of insincere, sort of deceptive behavior. So saying, kind of the conventions of society. If you're sort of displaying your grief in order to comply with the conventions of society, and here the way it's described is, the first half of the verse suggests that what you're doing is you're doing something that is unpleasant, something that's physically painful, as a way of expressing your grief, some outward display of, self-inflicted pain. Nöbe sirwa chesin kyan, right? Nöbe sirwa means to be oppressed by harm. Jeva means you inflicted that, you carried that out. And though having done it, yönden me means you don't necessarily think it's a worthwhile thing to do, right? Yönden means it's not. Yönden me can be taken two ways. Either it doesn't have any worthwhile purpose, or it is an inappropriate thing to do, right? Yönden me sheshindu means while knowing that it is a sort of meaningless act, then that kind of behavior is, kind of a form of deception, right? You're adopting some kind of deceitful behavior, and that is inappropriate. So this is kind of just kind of going on with this general idea of expressing grief. Jabelwa means plucking out hair. So apparently there is some social custom that pulling out your hair is an accepted way of showing grief. La sokpa jabelwa sok lula nerve sirwa chesu sinken yunte yeme nyamdu sheshindu. This is an interesting term, right? Sheshindu, it literally means knowingly, right? Mm-hmm. It's the opposite of unwittingly, right? It's knowingly doing something that you recognize is to be inappropriate. And this just from the point of view of language, this root is the same root as the word for a particular mental quality, which is very important in it's a psychological, it's one of the mental factors. It's called shishin, right? You know the word shishin, right? So shishin comes from samprajanya. So as soon as I saw this, it reminded me of that. So it's a kind of this shishin refers to a mental factor in which you observe yourself. You observe. You can, in the case of meditation, it's a form of introspection where you take note of what you happen to be thinking at a particular moment. So what am I thinking right now? If you sort of turn your mind inward to examine your thoughts, that is a form of shishi. But it's not limited to your thoughts. They're in practicing, for instance, in the Bodhicharya Avatar. I think it's is it not one of the chapters, Samprajanya? Yeah, I think it's the 5th chapter, right? 4th chapter is apramada, is mindfulness. 5th chapter is Samprajanya. So it talks about sort of being aware of your surroundings and sort of, acting in a kind of way in which you take note of what's, like when you get up to go, did I leave anything? That kind of thing. So it's that sort of sense of awareness. So anyway, just linguistically, it comes from that term of being aware. Okay, so it's not the way the word is being used here, but the root is the same. Okay, but now okay. These stories. I mean, if you think about it, the stories in these verses are amusing. So here, the example that's given for this story is this makes reference to probably the Indian custom of a widow committing suicide when her husband dies. The word is sati, right? In fact, during the time of the British, even recently, the practice was still being followed, and the British outlawed it because they thought it was horrific. But women were encouraged to throw themselves on their husband's funeral pyre. So here, I'm not sure if that's directly a reference to that, but here is talking about one woman is trying to show another woman how to commit suicide, right? So it says, Jeba means to take your life. Jeba, Labar Chao says, one woman says, no, I'm going to show you how to take your life. So what did she do? She took her own life.
Wow.
Dani searching. Dani searching means so that second woman, in fact, killed herself. And having done so, she felt proud that she had been a teacher for this other person. So again, kind of, this is, we could say this sardonic humor, I don't know. Okay, so this is supposed to be in keeping with the idea of following social conventions in a in a foolish way. Okay. I think one thing that's clear is the degree to which Buddhism, I just make this as an aside, that Buddhism is, as a religion, is not very concerned with telling people in society how to live the life according to the conventions of society. And without any judgment, I just make the observation that other kinds of religions, I mean, I think I wasn't raised Catholic, but my my sense of Catholicism is that Catholicism has a lot to say about how the followers are, they get very involved in the family life of their followers. And, there are other religions that have a lot. Yeah, Hinduism has all kinds of rituals about all the different things that represent you know they have marriage rituals. There's no such thing as a Buddhist marriage ritual, for instance. Um, and that's just to me. I just make that observation that Buddhism is not really interested in talking about the ideal way for a society to be organized and the members of that society to conduct themselves. They're more interested in sort of, kind of extracting themselves from the ordinary social life and living outside of society, which I just worth mentioning. Okay, so now we have, this is a very, how are we doing time-wise? Oh, I'm not observing the break policy. Do we need to take a break? Huh? Okay, let's take a break for a couple minutes.
It's funny, you really made me think. My father always used to say, wait till you're a parent. And when you're talking about the downward flow, the downward flow of the parent,
Yeah.
self-cherishing, attachment love of the child, and love of the child, and the negative criticisms of children upward. It's really, really fascinating.
I thought, when I first saw it, I thought maybe you are some kind of Indian Swami. How are you?
Great, yourself?
I'm good.
Yeah, good to see you. Yeah, I just came in for the weekend for some meetings.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, and I heard that you were teaching, so I just had a great meeting.
Heartburn? Oh, yeah, I know, I see
That
that.
was 4 days.
Karen, would you like an oatmeal?
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I'm okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming to me.
Oh, that's
I've had a hard time concentrating on the finding and concentrating.
that's fine. Oh, I didn't notice at all.
How are you?
Yeah, I know. How old are you again?
You're my age. I don't have a daughter.
I'm gonna give Amy away.
Yeah, right.
Okay, let's see. Maybe we'll do 2 more verses and call it a day. At least 2 anyway. So the next verse is introduced as again. This is Chandakirti's structure for tying the verses together. So he introduces this verse by saying, there's no value, right? Yenten me means there's no good reason to to torment yourself or cause yourself pain by grief in and of itself. Given the example of that, if it's done for purposes of social, conforming to social convention, he says, and then he says, well, the next verse suggests that the reason for doing it is to ensure that you will be able to gain contact with relations in the future. So the way he describes it as chima la, right? Chima means in the future. He says, let's see if I find the right verse here. Dupa Danjawa Tobar Durba. So Dupa Danjawa is saying that sort of the clinging to the idea that relations with a family member in this life are a good thing, then you would like to make sure that they occur in the future as well. So he said that's the way this next verse is sort of described as answering that notion, right? So it says, "Dupa dangyuan where is it? Yeah. Mena minjoan. Mena minjoan says, Mena minjoan is a phrase which means in the absence of something, then something will not occur. It's a logical term. Mena means if you fail to do this, then something else will not occur. Right? Mena minjoan. Mena minjoan. Jawa means that it's a necessary cause in order for that thing to occur. If you don't do this, then that can occur. So saying, if you don't sort of express the grief that you feel at the loss of your family member, then you're not sort of reinforcing the underlying cause of your affection for them, and therefore you won't be able to create those bonds in the future. Logically, Chandakirti is giving that as sort of the kind of the next level of what the verse is suggesting. It doesn't necessarily say that, but that's kind of how he interprets it, right? So you said sirwa la yunten me. Sirwa means that tormenting yourself. Yunten me means there's no inherent value to causing yourself pain as an expression of grief, but chima dan jawa tove chirdu, right? Chima means in the future. Jawa tove chirdu means in order to gain or to establish some kind of future family relations, right? Siroyang, Pangdu, Medo, it should be not Medu, it should be Medo. Therefore, I have to do this because it's a way to ensure that, I'll be able to, develop these kinds of family relations in the future. Now it's a very artificial way of introducing the verse, but when you understand this verse, the verse it's actually quite striking. I found this verse in particular to be very, I don't know, it just, the message is quite striking, I thought. All right, so he says it's kind of taking a broader sort of view of samsara, right? So it says, so the second line says, "Chiktendini yonsuk cham," right? The world, right? The world means samsaric beings. Yonsuk cham means they wander, right? Mm-hmm. So the wandering is sort of a kind of a synonym for the word of samsara, which means to be repeatedly reborn, right? So, and then it says, the way in which the world wanders, right? The way in which samsaric beings continually are reborn, it's as if, and then it says, as if that as we take on the lives successively, that when we do so, we're spreading suffering in the process. So not only is samsara itself, by its very nature, unsatisfactory, that we, as we go through our samsaric lives, we're sort of sprinkling seeds of more suffering by our attachments, kind of thing, right? And then the second half of the verse says, then so it says, means those beings who are already suffering, who are in a state of suffering, means to add to the suffering, to spread the suffering, means to share the suffering, means to pass along more suffering. Jishikja means what's the point of that, right? So it's kind of saying that samsara kind of is naturally is a state of unsatisfactoriness, and that we as samsaric beings, by our behavior, are not doing anything to diminish it. Rather, we're sort of encouraging that the suffering should be even stronger than it already is. That's kind of the idea that the verse is saying. So it's saying that it's talking again within the context of family relations, that the way in which we develop attachments in our families, that attachment is really creating circumstances to add to our samsaric suffering needlessly, basically. Okay, so he says the Jiktemba nam lewangi budam bumo yurne. So it says the way in which we develop family ties, right? Where one, so but there, for instance, in the Lamrim, in the section on reflecting on suffering, one of the categories of suffering is that Nyeba Mebidungal. It's called Nyeba Mebidungal, means the suffering that is not of a fixed nature. And in that section, it talks about the fact that those beings who in this life are our parents, right, in another life could become our children, right? And so it's saying that the relationships that we have in any given life are not fixed, that they fluctuate, and then there's a certain kind of that if you reflect on that, there's this sense of there, it's meant to give the idea that when we think of samsara sort of in the in the wider context of series of lifetimes, and we think about how the relationships that we have are always changing, then it's meant to convey that the relationships that we have in this life that we think of as being sort of some kind of like having some kind of fixed nature to them is really a fiction, and so when we invest those relationships with a certain kind of importance, we do so sort of foolishly. Okay, so he says, Jitemba Nam, then some samsaric beings, Leongi Buddha Bhumikuni. How does someone become your daughter or your son? They do so on the strength of their karma, right? Leongi Bhumikuni. And then when they do that, right, then when they become our children, right, and we develop the strong bond of affection and attachment towards them, then we are kind of giving them the role of being the source of added suffering when we are separated from them, for instance. So therefore, when they become, when they take on that family relationship to us, then then what they end up doing is, in the course of those, samsaric relationships, they are just sharing suffering, right? Giving us reason to experience more suffering. And says, that's the way samsara is. Because we're all sort of, in the interconnected relationships that we form from one life to another. So one sentient being that in this life may be our child, in another life they may be our parent, and as we come together, what we do to each other, in fact, is through those family relationships, we basically, give each other reasons to experience more suffering, more samsaric suffering. And so the idea of making that assertion is, that's kind of not wise, right? And so the appropriate kind of reaction to realizing that is that we should, want to sort of back out from getting so involved in those, strong family ties. So again, it's this idea that, samsaric family relationships are inhibit your spiritual pursuit. Okay, so that's kind of the main point. So this is, what's the point of that? What's the point of sort of, participating in that whole process of kind of giving each other more grief than you already have? So it says, so it says, by the very nature of samsaric existence, right? It's saying birth is suffering, right? Old age is suffering, sickness is suffering, death is suffering. And just the very samsaric condition is one of unsatisfactoriness. Then why do we add to that by, building up these strong attachments to our, family members? It says, sarva, dunga sarva, shen. Why do we sort of pass along one to another, back and forth, more suffering than we already have to endure? What's the purpose of doing that? And here he uses this image is one in Chandakirti like it's like throwing salt on a wound. Right? The samsaric state is like the wound, and we sort of magnify that suffering by our own unenlightened behavior. So he says, therefore, this is the idea is that family relations, trying to sort of perpetuate those kinds of relations with other samsaric beings, right? Striving to kind of recreate those family relations, there's absolutely no reason to do so, and we should not, cherish. From the Dharma point of view, we should not think of family life as something that we should kind of celebrate. What's the more appropriate thing to do is we should think of a method to free ourselves from this condition of samsaric suffering and apply ourselves to that. And then he gives the story here of, this idea of our meeting with other samsaric beings in the family setting is just creating circumstances, or that to the degree that we give importance to those family relationships, we are just creating circumstances to increase our suffering. So he says, this is a story he says of two brothers. One brother experienced the mother's death, right? The other brother experienced the father's death and the grief that accompanied that. And then the two brothers came together and they talked about the fact that each one had experienced the other parent's death, and then they both fell apart and experienced misery, right? So there were two brothers. In the presence of one, the father died. In the presence of the other one, the mother died. Then the two brothers, after their respective parents had died, they met, and then they just talked about the suffering of the other parent's death, and then that just added to the suffering that they had already experienced. Means they created suffering one for the other. There's no such purpose for us to add to our family members' suffering by our increasing our attachments, right? Okay? I like that verse. To me, that's a really kind of, it resonates for me, shall we say. Okay. Now, the next verse actually is very simple, but, the point is also clear. So he says, so the other person, the idea is that separation is obviously a source of, suffering. You lament the loss of your loved one, but on the other hand, the time that you spend after having met that loved one, that's a source of happiness, right? Dua, right? So here he says, Jawa, separation is a cause of suffering. However, Niendang Dua means then meeting with your family members is a source of happiness. So, sort of focus on the good parts and forget the bad parts. That kind of thinking, right? Therefore, it's okay for us to feel this bond of attachment for dear family members because we did have the good times, kind of, right? You see, you know, when you sit around with your family members, that's what you talk about. You talk about the good old days. So then, so here's the verse, and the verse says, he says, "Kangi dua kain de," means for the person who likes meeting with dear persons, right? Why is it that they dislike separation from that person, right? It's a question. And the question comes from the fact that, remember the end, from the four ends, right? The end of every meeting is separation. So the point of this verse is saying you can't have one without the other. He says you can't like meeting and having the opportunity to enjoy your relationships with someone else, and at the same time dislike the fact that at some point you're going to be separated from that person, because it's inevitable. Every time that you have a meeting with some person, it's going to end in separation. So you can't separate them. So he says, Dua dani jawadak. So now, actually, in the language, even there's this this convention of in Sanskrit they have. In English we have two numbers, right? We have singular and plural, right? Well, in Sanskrit there's three. There's singular, dual, and plural. So these two words are put together. Meeting and separation, and then the ending on this, it makes it one noun, but it's a dual noun. So it's meeting and separation. So it says dua dani jawa dak, and you see the Tibetan word dak, daga dak. It's not always the case, but that syllable is indicative of the dual case, right? So the plural in Sanskrit is nam, right? That's always plural. Dak sometimes is plural, but it can be used for the dual, and here it definitely is. So he says, do you not see, right? Tibetan is in the interrogative. I don't think that the original Sanskrit was, it's just saying it can be seen that meeting and separation are always go together, right? So it's saying that they are a pair, which is inseparable. So you can't simply focus your attention on the good times and ignore the fact that they're eventually going to lead to the suffering of loss that comes from separation. So the way the verse expresses this, it's saying, given that to the extent that you are drawn to having relationships that you find to be happy relationships, you're at the same time setting yourself up for the pain that's going to come when there's an inevitable loss, and therefore you would be better off to avoid both. It says, "Dua gawe guyimba te jawa jita gawe gur sem ripa mainte ripartel." Right now, you shouldn't think that it's improper to dislike separation, because if you like meeting, you're gonna get the separation. So you're asking for the separation when you show your pleasure with meeting. Right? 교화단 나왔다 현지 교화 나와 민남 때 건널 교회 치료 건널 교회 치료 means they always come together, right? Oh yeah, so then this is a story which actually in the English translation she says I think she says black nose. Do you have the translation? Yeah, it's not nose, it's actually ears. Black ears is the name of misfortune. Misfortune is referred to as the one who has black ears. And then, so the story is that this person tried to propitiate fortune. Fortune is the name of the goddess of good fortune, Shiri Tashima. And so the goddess of fortune answered the prayer, and the expression is gave a boon, right? Let's see, I don't know if it uses it, I don't think it uses that word in here. There, in the Tibetan, there is a word for it. At any rate, so then the story says that when the goddess Fortune came into this person's house, at the same time, the black-eared one, Misfortune, entered together with her, and so then the person says, "Well, I didn't invite, black-eared one to come into the house," and so Fortune says, "Well, she comes along with me." So this is supposed to be, you don't get one without the other. Then another one is kase dukje. Kase dukje means a food which has poison in it. You eat the food tastes good, you don't know it has poison in it, but at a later time, you're going to feel the poison will become active in your system, and then you'll experience that suffering. So the attachment that you develop towards family members, however enjoyable you may think it is, you're creating the conditions for you to feel that much greater pain upon separation. So that one's pretty straightforward. Maybe we'll read one more.
Sure.
Okay, so this one is still talking about meeting and separation, but it's talking about them on a cosmic scale and not in the normal way of meeting of person, but the fact that it's talking about an idea which I sometimes describe when we're reading text, and that is that the ordinary person, sort of like the person who has not been exposed to Dharma at all, is a person who typically is focused only on this life. They don't think about the fact that they had a previous life, or that there are future lives to come after this one. And from the spiritual perspective, it's very important, it's crucial that we come to see ourselves in this life as, as this being one phase of a series of countless past lives and the potential for countless future lives in samsara, depending on how we happen to live our current life. And so that's a perspective that has to be brought to our attention, and to sort of, develop that perspective. And that's what this verse is doing. So we'll read it, and I'll I think make some comment about it, how it's referring to that. So it says, Dela means the past. The past is without beginning, and the future is without end, right? So this is saying, samsara is this vast, potential of, factual limitless past lives and potential limitless future lives, right? So it's in fact making that very point that, this life is, in that scheme of things, something that is really a very short period of time, and that we should see ourselves in that, against that backdrop. He says, then if that's the case, then he says, then now he uses a word. He's talking about separation and meeting, and so he says, then the meeting is now here is used in a more abstract way. Typically, when you say meeting, you mean meeting another person. So here he's talking about the present as the time during which meeting occurs. Mm-hmm. And the time during which separation occurs is that from which you're no longer experiencing. You're separated from the past, mm-hmm. which is gone, and you're separated from the future, which hasn't yet appeared. Okay. So it's not using separation and meeting in the way that it was being discussed before, of meeting a family member and being separated from a family member, but it's referring to the present as the time of meeting and the past and the future as the time of separation, that with which you are not currently in contact. So it's a much more abstract sort of use of those terms, but it's really the idea is to bring to your attention that that's how you should see yourself, as someone who is living your current life as a result of how you may have lived your past lives, and how you live your present life is going to determine what what kind of a future you may experience. But here it's saying, he says, why is it that you are only focused on meeting, right? You're only focused on meeting, meaning, but in using it in the other sense, it was like you only focus on what you like about being around people that you're in this present life and that you enjoy spending time with. But he says, why are you able to see that? So why is your attention, Tonga here means to notice. Why are you noticing that? Why is your attention focused on the here and now, right? Which is actually a very short, when the past and the future, which are limitless, are a much longer span of time, and therefore something that otherwise could be more noticeable or more consequential. Why are you not thinking of that? Why do you not see that? Why do you not think of that? Means why do you not recognize that your current life is something that was created by your past karma, and your future life is going to be created by your present karma? Why don't you think about that? And he's describing that in terms of the word meeting and separation, where meeting means the present, what's going on right now, and separation means you're a product of the past, and you're an engine that's creating your future. So saying, look at your life in that perspective, that in terms of dependent origination. Okay, so it says, so it says, so it says, is it that you think somehow that separation doesn't last for a very long time, and therefore you don't need to be as concerned about it, and that meeting is something that is dua, is yun ringwa, lasts longer, and therefore you think of it. I mean, think of it in sort of in the ordinary sense way. Your relationship with the people that you feel close to, you think, oh, it spans years. I mean, the separation, it happens in an instant, right? So focus on the good and the fact that it comes to an end at some point. it's something that happens, and then it's gone. So it's of less consequence. So he's kind of taking that and flipping it around and saying, really, the here and now is something that is really only an instant compared to the past and the future. And right?
Yeah.
Okay, I think it's clear, right? So he says, you might tell me, he's asking the question, is it so that meeting is really something that lasts for a long time and separation is only short-lived? He says, Korwape kyo namki. Korwape kyo means if you are a samsaric person, then the past has no beginning, right? There's no limit to your past lives. There's no point before which you did not exist. It just keeps going time-wise. Mahombe dulayan, and in the case of the future, if you remain a samsaric being, there also will be no end, right? Tamayoba minna kisenchina kirki dushin to tuin doing tonshin. Why is it that you're focused on the time that you spend in meeting people, which is actually short, right? When in fact the separation from them, right? Whoever you have relationships with in this life, compared to that, you're going to be separated from them, and the span of time that represents the separation before you met them is endless. After you leave them, also is much longer and a much greater consequence, like that. Okay. So why do you give such attention? Why do you see? Why do you notice? Why are you more attentive to the here and now rather than the period of separation of the past and the future, which by comparison is vastly longer? Dela Gyoar Miche, Dela Gyoar Miche, Du Junseki. And by not noticing it, right? So here's a word. This is the Tibetan word Gyoa. Gyoa literally means in colloquial Tibetan, it means sadness. But in the terms in a spiritual sense, that word actually means to be upset. So why are you not upset about the vastness of your past lives and the vastness of your future lives, which are, in terms of time, incomparably greater than the time that occurs now in this life when you have the opportunity to meet with other people. Du jungse means jungse means just a very little bit. So the very short time of this life during which you are able to meet with people and enjoy your, samsaric relationships, you become, completely focused on that and that alone and develop attachments with blinders on the past and the future. Why do you do that? He says, so he says, in fact, you ought to develop some apprehension and some concern about that. Can't do anything about the past, but you can about the future, and you should develop the sense of. This is a very important term. This term gyoa is the Sanskrit word is udvega. Udvega means to become agitated, to become upset, to become. It's the opposite of complacency, and it means that you should have a sense of apprehension about the samsaric condition, and that apprehension should motivate you to extricate yourself. So that gyoa, that sense of concern, is a necessary condition for what we call renunciation, right? Unless you have some sense that everything is not all right, right? You won't have any reason to think you need to do anything to make your life better in a spiritual sense and seek some kind of then worthy goal. Oh yeah. So that's what gyoa means. Korwa like gyoa. Korwa means samsara. Korwa like gyoa means you have to develop the sense of there's a story in when the Buddha after Buddha's enlightenment, he reflected and was considering whether or not to teach what he had gained enlightenment about, and he thought about some of his past teachers, and they were no longer alive. So he then determined that there were 5 ascetics that he had previously practiced spiritual, like self-mortification with. And so he sought them out, and those were the first people that he taught the Dharma. Immediately following that, so this is Deer Park, which is outside the city of Varanasi. And Varanasi is a very ancient Indian city, and not only a holy city, but also a commercial center. And so there was a son of a wealthy merchant, and his name was Yashas. I told a story in the Inner Science, in the opening part of Inner Science. I told it because Yashas was the first non-ascetic, first person from an ordinary family to become the Buddha's disciple. He was the 6th disciple. And Yashas was this very, son of a wealthy merchant. And what prompted him was, in the middle of the night, he woke up and he had apparently I guess what we would call a harem. And he saw, lying around the room, these women, they were sleeping. And as he looked at the scene, he had this sort of experience where he was startled by what he was doing with his life. So he saw, this sort of, the way it's described is, it was kind of like the aftermath of a party. When we think about after the parties, people are sort of, in a spent state. And so, he sort of looked at that and said, like, why am I living this life? And he became upset, and he left his home. He went out in the middle of the night, and he, according to the story, it suggests that he even contemplated drowning himself in the river. But he was very upset. So the Buddha was on the other side of the river, and the Buddha called him over. And so he wades across the river and becomes the Buddha's disciple. So the point of the story is that feeling of disquiet that he experienced is an example of what we're all supposed to do about our own lives. Like, why am I living this meaningless existence that and become sort of upset about it, and then trying to find meaning. Because many young people, when they're in their 20s or so, often go through that kind of a thought process. Like, what are they going to do with your life kind of experience? It's like that, only it's more in a sense, in a more radical sense of, kind of what's the meaning of life kind of experience. Anyway, so the idea is that if you think about past lives and future lives as being sort of this endless passage of time, that should give you pause, that should give you concern, that what you do now in this very short span of time of this life, in comparison with that, is something to, contemplate. Oh yeah. Jen and image. Okay, so I think. Well, I'll read the story and then maybe we'll end the class. So here, this is these stories. Yeah, when you read these stories, sometimes it takes you a little while to figure out kind of what the point of the story is, or how the story actually connects with the verse. Mm-hmm. So this is a story of a person who was married, right? He had a wife, right? And then it says mikajik means a certain person. Jenaneva means he had gone to another land. He'd gone far away for business or whatever, right? Jenaneva means because of that period of time when he was away, then his wife, Chuma means his wife, then was, I guess you would say, seduced by another person, right? So Shengi means some other man. Dagircha, her husband was gone, and so this other person then they became attracted to each other, and she went to live with this other man, right? So he says, then this was unbeknownst to him, right? The idea of him being far away is this idea of separation, right? Mm-hmm. So during that long time that he was away, right, she wasn't his wife, so they were separated, but he was not aware of it, right? That's kind of the tie-in with the verse. Mm-hmm. And then it says, Yuldulemmatak. Then when he returned, as soon as he came back to his homeland, then he felt some suffering. Right? So it's saying he didn't feel any loss of his wife while he was living apart from her, right? Even though he was separated from her. It was only when he came back and realized that she had gone to live with another man that he felt some kind of suffering.
Yeah.
So
it's like a contradiction.
Well, yeah. Yeah, okay. So anyway, that's kind of the way the story goes. So he says, like that, Jitembana means ordinary persons. Duringur Jawala. Duringur Jawa means we have a separation from others, from those people that we have attachments to. Then when we leave them, when we get separated from them, right? Who knows if we'll ever, or anytime soon in future lives, meet again these people that we feel attached to in this life. So that separation from them could be many, many lifetimes, right? But we don't think about that. We just think about this short period of time when we are, in contact with those people that are close to us. So he says, Durimbu Jawa means you're going to be separated from them for a very long time, but you're not thinking about that, right? And you don't, Nyangin micheba means, so here again, now he brings in the word sorrow. So here, sorrow is being used in a different sense, right? Previously, the word sorrow was being used in terms of the grief at the loss of a family member. Here, sorrow is being used in the sense of samsaric sorrow, sense of that apprehension, that sense of disquiet about, the lengthy number of lives, a long period of time during which you're going to be separated from the people that you are attached to during this life. Nyangin micheber means you don't think about that. You don't feel any sorrow about that. Jungte jawala So therefore he says, he compares that to the separation that will be short-lived separation as inconsequential, right? So the short-lived separation is the separation that we might experience in this life. The one that ordinarily we feel grief about. Just forget about it. So the thing to feel some kind of concern about is the separation that is going to take place in our countless future lives that are by their very nature a form of suffering as well. So that we lose sight of, that we don't think about. Instead, we think about this inconsequential separation from people in this life. Mirikso. Okay, so maybe we'll leave it there. And this is verse 21. So there are still 4 verses left in the chapters. Next week will be the last class for a little while, and we should be able to finish up this chapter, and then have to take a break. I don't know if any of you have any questions. Sorry?
Please come back and teach some more.
I'm planning to. So if you have any questions, you're very patient to sit there and listen to me go on about this material. Huh? Oh, well, you're required to say that. Okay. I'm sorry? Oh, okay, well, okay. She counts more than you do. All right. So anybody have anything they want to, any reaction or anything that you want to bring up or say anything about it? Please.
Well, it's interesting. I like, obviously you pointing out that it helps to read the passage from the point of a monastic speaking to other monastics, but something like that.
Well,
Or a monastic speaking to a householder.
yeah, I think probably more that way. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, not to adopt the householder position.
I think the hypothetical audience is those people who have not yet chosen to follow the monastic life.
Right. Yeah. And so in your own experience, I want to appeal to your own experience as a person who sits here with their spouse, teaching the text.
Yeah.
Do you have some personal insight, or how I guess sort of the insight of how you personally relate to a text like this, as a guide for how we might, those of us who don't have the good fortune of being ordained at this time, in this life?
Well, that's. I do think about it. I mean, I think the thing that struck me as in the last few weeks as we've been going through this material is that in fact is really his message, especially in this first chapter. Is his message is, and talking about impermanence. I mean, I'm familiar with the topic of impermanence, and for me, the topic of impermanence in the Lamrim, teaching was not limited to ordained people. It's applied to me as well. I should be concerned about my mortality. I should think about the Dharma. So that was the thing that kind of caught my attention was that he's saying that message of impermanence should have a bigger impact on you, and that its ultimate sort of what should I say? What it should do is it should motivate you, to really pursue a spiritual life. And in the view of the author, that means, to give up the ordinary householder's life and to enter a monastic state. So that's the thing that kind of caught my attention. I don't ever remember having that kind of reaction from it in context of listening to the Lamrim teaching, right? And I don't know that I mean, my experience with Buddhist, teachers, monks in particular, my own teacher, in fact, I knew him from a pretty young age, from my 20s, before I was married. And we were riding subway in New York, in fact. And he was teaching a class in, I think it was Brooklyn. And he had monk's robes on. And it was, I was there, Chinula, I think, was there, and maybe 2 or 3 other people. And we going back to New Jersey, and those people riding on the subway, and they kind of were curious about him. Oh, you're a Buddhist monk, and then they noticed that we were the students, and they said something about, oh, are they going to become monks or nuns? And I remember very distinctly, he said, no, he said, that's not necessary. And that was kind of his attitude toward Westerners. I mean, the reality is they're really, my observation of Westerners, the number of people that have, pursued ordained life, that the percentages are pretty high that once they do that, at some point they give it up. And I don't blame them, because I think they just really are not, the ideal setting, the environment for a Westerner to adopt that lifestyle. I certainly don't discourage anybody from considering it, but the conditions are not ideal in the West. I mean, that's sort of obvious. So the choices are, kind of limited. And anyway, if you've known any people that have, taken vows, anyway, you probably have talked to people and their experiences that at some point anyway, I won't characterize what people say, but they do, some people, they end up questioning it, sort of, they're not really, my sense of it is that they don't find it easy to follow what the monk's life or nun's life is supposed to be. And they're wandering around on the streets in robes anyway. And so at some point it doesn't seem to make sense, I guess. I mean, I don't want to put words into people's mouths, but I think it's hard. As someone who was interested in Buddhism a long time ago, the thought entered my mind, to what it might be like to follow that life. But I don't. That particular event that I described to you, that really, left its mark on me, and I think that kind of, sort of settled it for me. I think when he said it wasn't necessary. But if you read the text, even if you read the Mahayana text, for instance, right? There's a section in the Mahayana text where they talk about, they use the word paksha. Paksha means chok. Chok means sort of means like a faction, like a group. So there are 2 main factions of spiritual practitioners: the householders and the celibate, monks or nuns. And they're both considered legitimate ways you can be a bodhisattva and be a householder. You can be a bodhisattva and be an ordained person. But both now these are texts from the 3rd, 4th century, so we're talking about a long time ago. But Asanga in the Bodhisattva Bhumi, and also the verses in the Mahayana Sutra Alankara, which are kind of the 2 works that are kind of related, they both make the statement that the ordained person's life is preferable, because the ordained person's life is not subject to the hindrances that family life presents to people. So I think that's kind of the perspective that Aryadeva is expressing as well. Yeah?
Thank you.
Okay. Maybe we'll leave it there. Okay. Ringu bele zonini kadarayam bakashi sabate lo me mariki tongro wanam namjeng yawe wangbo da gyuji dharma zambe zera kundu yang Jambe yangi zewe jesune Dembe rimba gunzalam gijo Nyene drube gyanam nye jesho Rangi jishin tobe lam yine Shudra zewe janbe takegi Drowe yiki mumba sechene, Gyewe demba yurin zingyuji, Demba rinchen chogi magyabam, Kyagyanyamba gyube chodeni, Ninje jembu yira gyobayi, Pende derde zawaje basho, Seje gyawe me junjin lele, Ledru janju langirin begyang, Pandu namgi yila beterjing, Gyawe zeba grindu kyang gyuji, Lam san drube dunken drube jing. Yegen seje mina mi minkun. Zera kundu gawe ngabayi. Nanda lam dandra war magyujik. Ganze teba chola chu chu chu. Sujin drubla zumba deyize, Tuden namki tatu drocheshin, Drashi gyatsu chokun kya yurushi, Kawadi kyawokun, Sunan yeshi zozo shing, Sunan yeshi lejunwe, Tamba kuni toba sho. Okay. Hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you.